The political ground underneath New York City has fractured. And look, this isn't just about some budget disagreement. This is a political earthquake. It's one that exposed a fatal flaw right at the heart of the modern progressive movement. Zoran Mamdani, the man hailed as this socialist rising star, he just watched his entire policy platform, this multi-billion-dollar vision of free everything, get instantly and publicly demolished. And not by his opponents, but by his own party's governor. Governor Kathy Hochul, she didn't debate his agenda. She just vetoed the one funding mechanism that was supposed to pay for all of it, and that caused an instantaneous collapse of his entire movement. We are talking about the utter devastation of a political philosophy that promised a utopia, built on just vast spending, only to be revealed as having absolutely no legal or financial foundation. Not from day one. So what happens to a political revolution when a single stroke of a pen confirms that its multi-billion-dollar platform was in fact impossible? Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast.
And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. When we look at the scope of this failure, it is difficult to overstate the political devastation here. Mamdani's supporters, they spent months, even years, celebrating him as this generational figure.
Someone who was ready to implement a complete ideological reset. But now, they're left with nothing. Just rubble. So let's unpack the core promise that he made. Because it wasn't just incremental change, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was a total overhaul. And it was based on this premise that cost was, well, basically irrelevant.
As long as the wealthy paid for it.
Exactly. And that's really the critical starting point. Mamdani's movement took off because it offered this highly seductive platform.
Seductive is the right word for it.
It is, because it bypassed all the painful realities of, modern finance and resource scarcity.
Yeah.
He built his entire campaign on this concept of a cost-free utopia, one where all the economic barriers that are crushing working families would just vanish.
And this wasn't just about expanding a few services.
No. This was a foundational commitment to free everything. We're talking about a massive, massive expansion of the welfare state. Free, universal access to city buses, to transit systems, eliminating fares completely. Free, fully subsidized childcare for all income levels. An enormous expansion of subsidized housing, if not entirely free housing programs.
And food as well, right.
And even initiatives guaranteeing free food programs. I mean, the rallying cry was a city where the bill basically never comes due. At least not for the average person.
Right.
And through this vision, Mamdani managed to galvanize this activist base, a younger demographic that saw him as the definitive socialist rising star. The enthusiasm, it wasn't just political, it was almost spiritual. It was driven by this belief that money wasn't the problem, only political will.
But that enthusiasm, it ran smack into a brick wall called state law. And this, I think, is the most confounding part of the story for so many people. Mamdani's success was based entirely on this one promise: massive tax hikes on the state's wealthiest residents and corporations. But the second governor, Hochul, blocked that single funding mechanism. The whole house of cards just collapsed. So the shocking part here is that the platform wasn't just, difficult to fund or politically tricky. Our sources say it was structurally, legally impossible from the very beginning. How does a candidate, backed by serious organizations, get this far without addressing that foundational legal reality that was blocking him?
That is the central tragedy here, and it's the fatal flaw of the entire Mamdani movement. It relied on a political fiction.
A fiction.
Absolutely. You hit on the most critical legal reality. New York City does not have the power, what's often called home rule power, to raise income taxes on its own. It just can't do it. State law requires that any income tax increase, especially one designed to generate billions, has to be approved by the state legislature in Albany.
And the governor.
And, crucially, it has to get the governor's signature. Mamdani campaigned as if his victory in the city would somehow just override decades of state constitutional precedent.
He thought momentum would be enough.
He assumed ideological momentum could just substitute for legislative reality. I mean, the political maneuver was pretty clear. We win the local election on this huge mandate, and then use that mandate to pressure a reluctant Albany into compliance. But in the end, the system worked exactly as it was designed, and the governor held the line.
And the voters who backed him are now waking up to this.
Well, the public reaction we're seeing now reflects this moment of profound realization. Voters who were energized by this promise of revolutionary change, they now feel profoundly misled, confused, and deceived. They're realizing that these huge, sweeping promises were never grounded in law or even financial reality.
So the political will was there in the city.
The political will was there, but the necessary legal authority was 150 miles north in Albany, and the person holding that authority just said no.
And we have to emphasize the context of this. I mean,
Yeah.
the failure of due diligence. Mamdani was promising billions, right? Estimates were from what, $10 to $20 billion a year?
Depending on the program, yes. Massive numbers.
And yet he never once explained the actual budgetary mechanism. No backup plans. If the city can't levy the tax and Albany says no, there was no plan B.
There was no plan B.
So was the lack of a blueprint, this no budget plan, was that an oversight? Or was it, the necessary fiction to keep the movement alive?
I lean heavily toward the latter. It was a failure of transparency that was disguised as ideological purity. Any serious fiscal analyst would have immediately identified the legal requirement for state approval. It's not a secret.
Right.
But the Mamdani movement, they substituted a detailed budget plan with a simple, very resonant slogan, tax the rich.
And that was the whole strategy.
That was the entirety of the financial strategy. In any other political environment, a candidate promising billions in new spending without an itemized revenue stream, he'd be dismissed immediately. But Mamdani's movement was protected by its ideological bubble. They deliberately downplayed the complexity of funding. They claimed any resistance to their tax plan was just the work of, corporate interests or establishment corruption trying to block the will of the people.
A very convenient narrative.
It is. And this narrative allowed them to avoid the detailed, painful work of legislative negotiation and fiscal reality. They offered these slow promises of an eventual wealth transfer, but they had no mechanism to actually accelerate the funding when the political moment arrived. So his movement, it just slammed into that legal brick wall the moment Hochul blocked the only proposed revenue source. And it exposed the entire structure as hollow.
Okay, so let's pivot to that exact moment, the moment of intervention, the governor's surgical strike.
Yeah.
Because Governor Hochul didn't just put out a press release. She made a very public stand. She flatly stated she would not raise taxes on the rich. This wasn't just a veto. This was a deliberate public declaration of a specific economic philosophy designed to counter that progressive narrative.
It was. And her move was, in a political sense, genius, even if it provoked absolute rage on the left. She delivered a reality check with surgical precision. By standing at that podium and declaring her refusal, she wasn't just blocking a bill, she was killing an entire political ecosystem.
And the consequences were immediate.
Total and absolute collapse. Instantly. Without those massive progressive tax hikes, which again were the sole financial engine for Mamdani's agenda, the entire multi-billion-dollar platform collapses instantly.
No winding down.
No gradual phasing out, it simply ceases to exist. And Hochul understood the weight of her words. She made it clear she would not budge, didn't blink, didn't apologize for it. She repositioned herself, not as an enemy of social programs, but as the protector of the state's fiscal solvency. And that was her defining moment, separating what she sees as responsible democratic governance from this revolutionary progressive ideology.
And crucially, she backed this decision up with some devastating economic data. She used numbers that resonated instantly with fiscal conservatives and centrists, and at the same time, terrified the progressives, the figures she cited. 1.5% of New Yorkers fund 1/3 of the entire state budget. That dangerous math is the core of her defense. We need to spend some time on what catastrophic concentration risk really means for New York's finances.
This statistic is the economic skeleton key to understanding New York's perpetual fiscal crisis. It truly is. When 1.5% of your population, and this is a highly mobile, highly liquid group of individuals, when they're responsible for generating 33 cents of every single dollar the state spends, the state economy is resting on an extremely precarious foundation. That is the very definition of catastrophic concentration risk.
Put that into real-world terms for us.
Okay, imagine you run a small country, and the health of 1/3 of your entire national treasury depends on the continued residency and income stability of, say, roughly 150,000 households. If those households face a downturn in the market, or if they decide to relocate because of political instability or punitive tax laws, the effect isn't a minor budget adjustment. It's a multi-billion-dollar hemorrhage that happens almost instantaneously.
It's not a slow leak. It's a gusher.
It's a gusher. And Hochul's defense wasn't abstract. It was based on mathematical modeling. She argued that increasing the tax burden on this tiny group would push them past their tolerance threshold. It would trigger an accelerated outmigration. Her core argument was this: We cannot afford to lose even a fraction of that 1.5% because there is no way for the state to replace those billions quickly.
The middle class can't fill that gap.
The middle class simply does not possess the collective wealth or income capacity to fill that gap. This is not political theory. This is the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of high-tax state finance.
And the progressive response to that is usually, oh, they won't leave, they love New York. But our sources in recent history, they suggest that flight is already happening. And they don't just take their income tax with them, do they? They take an entire economic footprint.
Exactly. And Hochul used that history as her evidence. She pointed out that wealthy residents were already fleeing long before Mamdani ever even took office. They were spurred by previous tax hikes and just the general anticipation of more punitive policies to come.
The preemptive exodus.
That's what we call it, a preemptive exodus. High net worth individuals, company headquarters. They have sophisticated legal and financial teams dedicated to minimizing tax exposure. When the political climate signals a hostile future, they don't wait for the bill to pass.
They're already gone.
They began establishing residency elsewhere, often in zero-income tax states like Florida or Texas. So Mamdani's proposed tax increase, it wasn't just a revenue generator, it was a powerful accelerator. It would have guaranteed that those who are maybe debating relocation would immediately execute their exit strategy.
And the cost is huge.
The economic cost of losing these individuals is exponential. They take their personal income taxes, their capital gains taxes, the jobs they fund, personal assistants, lawyers, household staff, the sales taxes from their consumption, and the property values tied to their real estate. Hochul was effectively arguing that Mamdani wasn't just proposing new spending, he was threatening the structural viability of the existing tax base. She chose stability over ideological warfare.
So let's talk about the fallout from that.
Yeah.
Because the moment Hochul delivered that verdict, the progressive base, they did not take it with reasoned debate.
No.
It triggered a full-scale emotional meltdown, a sense of instant panic and just raw betrayal.
The reaction was visceral, it was immediate, and it was overwhelmingly emotional. The progressive movement had internalized Mamdani's success as their own undeniable victory. It was proof that their ideology had finally won. So when Hochul, a fellow Democrat, publicly refuted their entire premise, the shock was profound.
Here's an edge.
Group chats, organizer circles, every left-wing influencer space erupted in disbelief and just pure fury. They felt not just defeated, but personally humiliated. They saw Hochul as a traitor, someone who had sided with the billionaire class and corporate interests over the demands of the people.
This backlash went digital immediately.
Oh, instantly. Massive social media campaigns, hashtags like #PrimaryHook and #TaxRickNow just shot across every platform. They saw the governor as having demolished their biggest ideological victory, not with a better idea, but with a politically expedient defense of the status quo.
And the anger didn't just stay online, did it? It spilled out into the real world. It became confrontational. It targeted Hochul herself.
Absolutely. The ideological rage became physical and public. Mamdani supporters, the dedicated, tax-the-rich faithful, they immediately recognized Hochul as the direct source of their movement's demise.
So they went after her.
They targeted her public events. We saw videos of organized heckling where activists would swarm her speeches, shouting her down, forcing her to pause. It frequently required security intervention. The atmosphere was charged with this intense personal animosity. These activists felt betrayed, abandoned, and humiliated. Their heroes platform, this promise of a progressive utopia, had been reduced to ashes by a single measured statement of fiscal reality. And the anger was amplified because they felt politically powerless despite all their organizing. They had been told they won, only to discover they'd built their castle on sand.
So while the base was raging outside, what was happening inside Mamdani's own operation, that sudden collapse must have created instant chaos.
A catastrophic operational crisis. It was a scene of instantaneous organizational chaos. The staff was divided, arguing furiously over the immediate messaging strategy. The core dilemma was just paralyzing. If they blamed Hochul directly, they risked alienating other potential state allies and, confirming that their plan was always dependent on external permission. But if they pretended the plan was still viable, they risked looking completely delusional. So they were scrambling, stumbling through statements that often contradicted the strong, uncompromising language of the campaign.
And the money started to dry up.
Immediately. This operational failure was mirrored by an immediate resource retreat. Progressive organizations, activist PACs, the major donors who had provided crucial funding and endorsements, they suddenly and dramatically backed off.
Why so quickly?
The withdrawal was based on immediate fear. Fear of being associated with an agenda that had just been publicly labeled as financially reckless and legally impossible. They had invested in a winner. When the winner instantly became a loser, the money froze. It confirmed that their support was conditional on momentum, not a deep commitment to the financial viability of the proposal. Mamdani himself was left isolated, just struggling to pivot and defend an agenda he had loudly guaranteed for months, now knowing it was entirely dead.
And this event, it didn't just kill one policy proposal. You're saying it triggered what many are now calling a full-scale civil war within the Democratic Party. It split the coalition in the most public way possible.
That is precisely what happened. The tension between the progressive wing and the establishment wing has always been there, bubbling under the surface.
Sure.
But Hochul's action was the detonator. The fault lines just split wide open, creating this vicious public battle.
So what do the battle lines look like?
On one side, you have the progressive wing. It's led by high-profile figures like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her allies. They launched direct, aggressive attacks on Hochul. They accused her of institutional failure, arguing she was prioritizing her wealthy donor base over the needs of the working class. The rhetoric was uncompromising. Mamdani's failure was framed not as a fiscal mistake, but as an act of political cowardice and corruption by the Democratic old guard.
And the other side,
Yeah.
the establishment Democrats.
They panicked. They saw Mamdani's reckless promises as a dangerous liability. They were terrified of scaring off businesses and, maybe more importantly, alienating those crucial moderate and working-class voters who value stability. The establishment insisted that Mamdani had handed a massive political gift to the opposition by demonstrating that the progressive movement was incapable of practical governance.
And this went beyond just the governor's office.
Oh, yeah. Activists intensified calls to primary longtime leaders like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Representative Hakeem Jeffries. They argued the old guard had failed them by not delivering progressive policy and instead protecting the existing economic structure. This is a battle for the soul of the New York Democratic Party, and the coalition is fracturing in public view, leaving mainstream voters just confused and frustrated by the sheer level of internal acrimony.
As we watch this political firestorm, we have to connect the chaos back to the measurable economic pain on the ground. I mean, New York's status as the most unaffordable state in America, that predates Mamdani. But his failure seems to have amplified the instability and the rate of business flight.
That label, the most unaffordable state in America, is a devastating starting point for any policy discussion. It reflects years of compounding factors, exceptionally high taxes, complex regulations, exorbitant housing and energy costs. Mamdani's promises, while politically appealing, were built on this already crushing reality. He was trying to solve unaffordability by simply shifting the existing tax burden rather than addressing the root causes of spending and regulation.
And the business community noticed.
The Mamdani debacle served as a final, definitive warning shot to them. We are now seeing business owners and corporate leaders speak publicly, acknowledging what used to be just private contingency planning. They're pausing expansions, canceling leases, and actively preparing escape routes to states that offer competitive tax environments. They're specifically mentioning Florida, Texas, and Tennessee.
And these aren't just threats.
These are not leverage tactics. These are real decisions being made about capital investment. When political instability reaches this level, CEOs have to prioritize their fiduciary duty, and that often means fleeing jurisdictions that actively signal hostility toward capital and wealth creation. The failure of Mamdani's plan only confirmed that the environment remains toxic for long-term growth.
And these are not just, nebulous threats floating around. Fiscal analysts are already signaling tangible, hard shortfalls in the state budget forecasts.
Yeah.
And it's driven by this policy uncertainty, not just global economics.
That is a crucial distinction to make. We are predicting significant budget shortfalls, but the analysts are clear. They are driven specifically by policy-induced behavior.
Meaning people leaving.
Meaning policy-driven flight and instability rather than a typical recession. The state is losing revenue because high earners are changing their residency and businesses are deciding not to expand, or worse, choosing to contract their presence in New York. This instability has sent shockwaves through the financial markets. It's led to a collapse in investor confidence.
What does that look like?
Investors now view New York as becoming too unpredictable, too hostile, too expensive for long-term commitment. When investors pull back, capital dries up and the economy slows down. We're already seeing the microeconomic effects. Landlords, particularly in Manhattan and the surrounding high-cost suburbs, they're reporting growing vacancies in the high-end rental market as higher-income tenants actively formalize their residency in lower-tax states. Mamdani's failed agenda didn't just delay progress. It actively accelerated the city's economic decline by injecting massive instability into an already fragile system.
And of course, the collapse of this progressive dream provided immediate, powerful ammunition for critics outside the state. Conservative commentators framed Mamdani's failure as a kind of national parable.
They seized the opportunity immediately. Conservative media and think tanks framed Mamdani's entire effort as a billion-dollar socialist scam hiding in plain sight. They used Hochul's own data to highlight the absurdity of the plan's financial reliance.
Let's go over those numbers again.
Okay, so the top 1% of New York City earners already contribute about 40% of the city's entire income tax revenue. Mamdani's progressive tax structure, analysts calculated, would have pushed that already minuscule group to shoulder an estimated 60% of the total income tax burden.
60%.
60%. This level of dependency is unprecedented. It geometrically increases that catastrophic concentration risk we talked about. Conservative analysts argued this dependency was not only morally unfair, but structurally suicidal. They pointed out that if just 10% of that top 1% decided to leave, New York City would face an immediate, irrecoverable budget hole of maybe $4 to $5 billion.
Wow.
They concluded that New York was the national poster child for the dangers of runaway socialism, demonstrating how ideological goals, when they're divorced from market and fiscal realities, inevitably lead to self-destruction.
And the political weight of this failure, it resonated all the way to the top. We saw a direct response from former President Donald J. Trump, leveraging New York's turmoil into a national economic contrast.
President Trump wasted no time. He used New York's turmoil as a textbook example of blue state collapse economics. He drew a powerful, highly visible contrast between the chaos, high taxes, and outmigration in high-tax blue states like New York and California versus the economic vitality and in-migration seen in red states like Texas and Florida.
It's a simple, potent argument.
It is. Trump's argument was simple. The collapse wasn't an isolated accident. It was the natural outcome of policies that punish success and drive away job creators. He connected the dots for the national audience, arguing that if policies like Mamdani's were allowed to take hold, they would lead to widespread economic stagnation and flight across the country. His message was centered on the concept that prosperity follows freedom, not socialism, a direct challenge to the central tenets of Mamdani's ideology. This positioned the New York political failure not just as a local footnote, but as the clearest possible evidence for his core economic philosophy on the national stage.
So as we approach the final reckoning here, let's be very clear about the status of Mamdani's socialist revolution. Is this a temporary setback, or was it an irreversible political death blow?
It is unequivocally the latter. This socialist revolution wasn't delayed, it wasn't paused, it wasn't slowed down. It is functionally dead. Hochul's refusal to raise taxes wasn't an inconvenience. It eliminated an entire financial foundation.
There's no money.
You cannot promise billions in new spending without the billions in revenue to back it up. Without the state authority to enforce the tax hike, Mamdani has no fiscal leg to stand on, and the movement's central promise is now revealed to be completely hollow. The internal conflict now is just a blame game. Far-left activists are engaging in intellectual gymnastics, desperately blaming everyone else, the rich, the corporations, the governor, the system, for destroying their utopian dream. They can't internalize the possibility that the plan itself was flawed.
And the moderates.
Meanwhile, moderates within the Democratic Party are sighing in relief, arguing that someone finally halted the runaway spending fantasies that they believed were endangering the state. Mamdani, once the progressive golden child, is now isolated, visibly struggling to pivot and defend proposals that everyone, including maybe himself deep down, knew were impossible to deliver without a cooperative governor.
This whole spectacle, it just leaves the Democratic Party with this brutal public weight of contradictions. The fault lines that were exposed are splitting open in real time, showing a party that is, well, functionally ungovernable when it comes to fiscal matters.
That is the ultimate takeaway for the party infrastructure. The movement was completely unprepared for reality. They focused so intensely on the theoretical moral justice of their spending proposals that they simply ignored the fundamental mechanics of funding and the legal authority they needed. The internal conflict is now paralyzing. Progressives blame moderates for lack of ideological courage and capitulating to wealth. Moderates blame progressives for irresponsible, reckless behavior that terrified the tax base and alienated crucial working families who are tired of perpetual crisis.
And the ordinary voter is caught in the middle.
The tragedy for the ordinary voter is the constant infighting and the broken promises. Voters are looking at a party that's more focused on ideological purity battles than on solving the crippling problems of cost of living, crime, and infrastructure. These deep ideological divisions, confirmed by Hochul's veto, are not going to heal quickly. It makes effective governance incredibly challenging.
Which leads us to the pivotal crossroads facing New York. Given the accelerating economic decay and this political paralysis, what is the fundamental choice confronting lifelong blue state voters now?
The complete failure of this progressive agenda, combined with the visible acceleration of economic decay and political chaos, has created a major, irreversible turning point. Lifelong blue state voters, people who would never, ever consider voting Republican, are openly expressing profound frustration.
They're just tired.
They are tired of the financial costs of political fantasy. They are fatigued by the constant crisis management, the skyrocketing taxes, and the realization that their leaders seem more invested in these internal ideological battles than in practical, fiscally stable governance. The choice facing New York is stark. And it's being framed not as a typical political choice, but as a matter of state survival.
To stay or to go.
In a sense. Does New York continue down this path of ideological purity and increasing tax dependency on an ever-shrinking wealthy base, risking accelerating outmigration? Or does it choose a stable, fiscally responsible path aimed at wealth retention, business growth, and practical management? The state is not just seeking direction. Given the accelerating economic indicators and the lack of a fiscal foundation for the progressive vision, it is now desperate for rescue.
A complex story indeed, demonstrating how quickly ideological momentum can shatter when confronted by legal and fiscal reality. Thank you for walking us through the depth of this political and economic collapse.
Thank you, and thank you to our listeners for joining us as we explored these crucial details.
That's all for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.